Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Friday, December 2nd, 2022. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, President Biden says that he has no immediate plans to contact Russian President Vladimir Putin, but he did say that he'd be willing to talk with the Russian leader if he was prepared to end the war in Ukraine. So Biden said this at a joint press conference with French President Macron, who is in the US for a 3-day visit. Biden said, quote, "I have no immediate plans to contact Mr. Putin. I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet," end quote. So Russia has maintained that, throughout the war, Russia has said that they're open to talks with the US and Ukraine about the war. But there's little chance right now that, Putin's ideas for ending the war would be acceptable to Biden and vice versa, because Russia is going to want a guarantee on Ukraine's neutrality. And at this point, too, they've annexed these Ukrainian oblasts, and I don't see them giving them up too easily. They definitely are going to want to keep Crimea. So just the idea, I have a much more pessimistic view on the prospect of diplomacy than I did a few weeks ago. Um, and just the idea that Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the U.S. would find an acceptable peace deal, for either side. It just seems very unlikely right now. Unfortunately, it seems like there's going to be a lot more fighting and people dying. So Biden, he has not held any talks with Putin since Russia invaded on February 24th. Unlike Macron, Macron has actually maintained dialogue with Putin. And he's gotten a lot of heat for it from more hawkish members of NATO, including Poland and the Baltic states. Of course, the comparison that everybody makes is, I know Poland has said, "Oh, it's like talking to Hitler," um, but Macron, with at this press conference with Biden, he reaffirmed that he would continue speaking with Putin to try to prevent escalation, which makes a lot of sense. And Scholz as well, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, he's also been speaking with Putin since the war started. But it really is amazing, the attitude towards diplomacy really in the US and other NATO countries too, but really it's just gotten such a bad, it's just amazing the way people look at diplomacy now. It's just a really shows how the state of things are, how far we are, I think, from resolving this war. Just the idea of talking to Putin is just so controversial. So while there has been an increase in dialogue between the U.S. and Russia in recent months, there was the CIA chief talked with his Russian counterpart. Jake Sullivan was speaking with his Russian counterparts, but it seems like that was more just over looking to um, about the use of nuclear weapons, warnings not to use them, kind of a little de-escalation of tensions between the U.S. and Russia, but nothing concrete on towards ending the fighting. And Russia did pull out of nuclear arms control talks this week, citing differences with the U.S. over the New START treaty and tensions over Ukraine. So Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, he was asked on Thursday about a potential Biden-Putin meeting, and he said that Russia never shuns dialogue, and he pointed to the fact that Putin has spoken with Macron and Scholz, and he's basically saying anyone that wants to have a call with Putin has the opportunity to do so. Um, so there's that. And Biden, of course, Biden and Macron, during their meeting and their press conference and all their statements, reaffirm that they're going to keep supporting Ukraine in this war with Russia. Okay, so the next story we have here, Russia says that the US and NATO are directly involved in the Ukraine war. So this came from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. He said a lot of things on Thursday. Um, He said, quote, "You shouldn't say that the US and NATO aren't taking part in this war. You are directly participating in it, and not just by providing weapons, but also by training personnel. You are training their military on your territory, on the territories of Britain, Germany, Italy, and other countries," end quote. So I went over yesterday that the US is considering, dramatically increasing the training it's doing for Ukrainian soldiers, and that's mostly going to be in Germany. And Lavrov, he made these comments while defending Russia's strikes on civilian infrastructure, on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has left, millions of Ukrainian civilians in a really dire situation without power and without heat and without water. And it's cold in Ukraine right now. I was looking at the temperatures. It's, high 20s. And it's going to get colder. And it's just such a horrible situation. And, Russia's line here is that they're disabling energy infrastructure that allows the US and NATO to ship weapons to Ukraine. So Lavrov also warned that any conventional war between nuclear armed powers comes with a huge risk of nuclear escalation. He said that any war between nuclear powers is unacceptable. He said, quote, even if someone plans to start it by conventional means, the risk of escalation into nuclear war will be enormous, end quote. So that's another thing that, in the US, you think of all the hawks that, it was really at the outset of the war. I always think of Adam Kinzinger, the Republican in the House. That's just so horrible and hawkish. He was always calling for the no-fly zone over Ukraine. That's what Zelensky wanted to happen. And that would have involved the US and NATO not only shooting down Russian planes, also bombing to secure the airspace over Ukraine. They would have to bomb Russian missiles, surface to air missiles inside Russia. It would be war with Russia, direct war, World War III, and it would likely turn nuclear very quickly. So President Biden just, if you remember back in October, he said that the world was closer to nuclear Armageddon than at any time since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And although there has been a little uptick in dialogue between the U.S. and Russia, I think his assessment is still true. And there's no sign that the U.S. is backing down on its support for Ukraine. And this just risks an escalation. Really what Lavrov said here, and Russia has said this a lot, that the U.S. and NATO are directly involved, that they're at war with NATO, not just Ukraine. So by that logic, they could potentially bomb a NATO base in Poland or something. That's just a risk that this policy has of supporting this war on Russia's border. All right, the next one here. The EU tentatively agrees on a $60 per barrel Russian oil price cap. So this was according to a report from Reuters that the EU has agreed to set, they're looking to impose a price cap on Russian oil, and they agreed at $60 per barrel. And the plan would also include an adjustment mechanism to keep the price cap 5% below the market value. And the EU is setting the price cap at the request of the G7, which asked for the price to be slightly higher. They asked the EU to set it between $65 and $70 per barrel, and they set it a bit lower. So the EU governments, they still need to formally sign off on the price cap plan, which is expected to happen on Friday. The bloc struggled to set a price as Poland was seeking a drastically lower number, around $20 to $30 per barrel, basically what it costs Russia to produce oil. But no matter what the price is, Russia has said it will retaliate and cut off any country that's trying to impose the price caps. And of course, if they retaliate by slashing oil production, which I think is possible, it's going to send prices skyrocketing. And now there's another story we have on the page. It's lower on the page, but it says that gas prices in the U.S. are back to the levels they were before Russia invaded Ukraine and before all these sanctions, the U.S. and Europe put all these sanctions in place. Now, it's still high because gas prices were going up in the year leading up to this war. But, December 5th is the day that they're saying they're going to impose this price cap. And if Russia retaliates by cutting production, those gas prices are going to go right back up. So again, I know I've went over this a lot. The idea of the price cap is the EU's oil embargo, which goes into effect on December 5th. It includes a ban on insurance. Russian oil shipments still rely on European insurance. So they're worried that would disrupt the market and raise prices. So they devised this plan, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary. And the idea is if they're selling oil at this set price, then they could still provide insurance. But again, I just don't see it panning out. And also, I mean, if Russia just kind of plays along, shipping insurers have said that they don't think it's enforceable because they can't really know for sure what price the oil's being sold at. They say it's easy to kind of forge those documents. Okay, so the next one here, the Draft National Defense Authorization Act. It includes $3 billion in annual military aid for Taiwan. So Defense News reported this on Thursday, confirming what I thought was probably going to be included in this bill. But there is an issue for Congress, for the China Hawks, is that they're not sure if these funds are going to be approved, if they're going to make it through appropriations. So the funding, it includes $10 billion in the State Department's foreign military financing program over 5 years. So that's $2 billion a year for Taiwan. And foreign military financing, they give governments money to buy U.S. weapons. And then it also includes $1 billion in annual presidential drawdown authority. So that total is $3 billion a year. That's a lot. And the presidential drawdown authority is how mostly they've been arming Ukraine. It lets the U.S. send countries weapons directly from their stockpiles. So it's very quick that they could just ship it over. Because another thing they're dealing with Taiwan is a huge backlog of arms sales. Something like $19 billion in arms sales still haven't been delivered to Taiwan, which goes to show how much they've been selling them weapons. That's a ton of weapons, $19 billion worth. A big chunk of it is F-16s. I forget, they made some huge F-16 deal under Trump. So while the funding for Taiwan is included in the NDAA, and I don't understand exactly what the issue is here because they seem to have money, for whatever they want. But members of Congress are saying that they're not sure if it's going to get past the appropriations committees because apparently in the original NDAA or the original budgets that they set before they actually drew up the bill, this money wasn't in there. So they're saying that in order to get the funds for Taiwan, cuts need to be made elsewhere, and Democratic appropriators are not sure if they want to do that. Because the FMF is through the State Department, the foreign military financing, they don't want to cut from the State Department's budget, and it's not clear if they can increase, their top line budget. So the State Department's budget, just to show you how much of it goes to this military aid, State Department's budget in 2022 was $55 billion, and it included $6 billion for foreign military financing, which Taiwan does not yet receive. Taiwan does not receive any military aid from the U.S. They've always sold them weapons, but they haven't given them aid like this. This is unprecedented assistance that they're trying to give them. And the plan is to give them $2 billion. It would make them the second highest recipient of this program behind Israel, which receives $3.3 billion in foreign military financing. Israel also gets $500 million and that goes towards like their Iron Dome and missile defense systems. So it's $3.8 billion that Israel gets each year. And they got an extra $1 billion in 2022, I believe. So, but lawmakers, while they're saying that there's these issues, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are keen to begin providing this unprecedented military aid for Taiwan. And there's been talks, this plan that this $3 billion a year was devised, according to other reports I read, with the White House, with input from the White House and Congress and the National Security Council. Well, that is the White House, but so, everybody's really on board with this. So I bet they're going to be able to find the money. And a Washington Post report said that if they can't, they quoted congressional aides that said if this money doesn't get appropriated, the White House, Biden could ask Congress to approve it in emergency funds. And that's how they've been arming Ukraine. And so this money for Taiwan, specifically the $10 billion in the foreign military financing, it comes from the Taiwan Policy Act, which is a piece of legislation that was drafted by hardcore China hawks in the Senate. It was approved by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but that's as far as it went. And so they stripped the military aid out of it, added a little bit to it, and are trying to put it into the NDAA. And so this effort to arm Taiwan, as I'm always talking about, it comes as China has been really warning explicitly, against the U.S. increasing support for Taiwan, warning that it could lead to war in the region. And Mitt Romney, good old Senator Mitt Romney, he recognized this, how China would view this legislation. Before voting on the bill in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said, "We're doing something that's highly provocative and bellicose." And then he went ahead and voted in favor of it anyway. So, I mean, the fact that Mitt Romney is recognizing that, and Rand Paul actually wrote something really good about this in the American Conservative against this whole idea here. You go check that out. But yeah, if Mitt Romney's saying it's provocative and bellicose, whew. All right, so the next one, Lavrov, he said something else. He said that Russia and China are stepping up their military cooperation in response to NATO. So he's saying that the U.S. and NATO's move to focus on countering China in the Asia Pacific has led to an increase in cooperation between the Russian and Chinese militaries. He said, quote, "We know how seriously China regards these provocations by NATO in the South China Sea, let alone Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. We understand that this playing with fire by NATO in that part of the world carries threats and risks for the Russian Federation," end quote. So you see, he said NATO in the South China Sea. It's mostly the U.S., but in recent years, the U.S. has gotten its European NATO allies to go along and send ships to the region, including, I think, just over just the past year or in 2021 and early 2022, we saw the British, the French, and the Germans all send ships, and the British sent like a huge naval flotilla to Asia into the South China Sea. And Germany sent its first ship to the South China Sea for, it was something like 20 years. So it's clearly, they're sending a message to China when they do this. And NATO has identified, as I went over yesterday, China as a challenge to the alliance. And they said in documents that they should forge stronger relationships with countries in the Asia Pacific, including Australia, South Korea, Japan, and India as well. And building new alliances in the region is a key aspect of the U.S. strategy against China, which is outlined by the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. They released that back in February. Lavrov said that the U.S. and NATO are trying to create an explosive situation in the Asia Pacific and pointed to the AUKUS military pact. So AUKUS is a new treaty between the U.S., Britain, and Australia. It focuses on technology sharing. Australia is expected to receive technology to develop nuclear-powered submarines, which they will probably use to patrol waters near China, but they're not going to get them for years down the line. But still, also as part of this treaty, the U.S. is going to expand its military presence in Australia. I believe they're going to be deploying some bombers there soon. I think they're building facilities for them now. So China has previously warned that this effort to build alliances in the region could lead to this is what they call it, a Ukraine-style tragedy in the region, referencing, the NATO buildup in Europe that provoked the war in Ukraine. This was China's foreign minister, Wang Yi. He said this back in April, and he said it on a visit to Vietnam, which is a country in the Southeast Asia that is leaning more toward China. Wang said, quote, "The United States has tried to create regional tension and provoke confrontation by pushing forward the Indo-Pacific strategy," end quote. So the increasing military cooperation between Russia and China is clearly a natural reaction to the similar pressure that they are facing from the West. In a sign of these growing ties, Russian and Chinese bombers, they just flew a joint patrol over the Western Pacific on Wednesday. And we're starting to see things like that become more common. Yet U.S. officials, act surprised that when it's very clear that their policies are driving Russia and China together, they go ahead and act surprised, when they do drills like that. All right, the next one, the U.S. imposes new sanctions on North Korea after their ICBM test. So the U.S. imposed these sanctions on Thursday just on 3 North Korean officials that are said to be tied to the country's weapons programs, following a ICBM test by North Korea that took place on November 18th. So since this is similar to Iran, when you see the U.S. just come out with these sanctions against officials, North Korea is under such heavy sanctions. They're totally cut off to the U.S. It's not like these guys have assets in the U.S. The sanctions basically do virtually nothing, but what they will do is ensure that tensions on the Korean Peninsula remain high. North Korea has launched a record number of weapons tests this year as the US and South Korea have resumed massive war games. The two sides continue tit for tat escalations with no easing of tensions in sight. The US and South Korea are planning to expand upcoming anti submarine war games known as Silent Shark that are set to be held in 2023. This iteration of these drills are expected to be the largest ever, and North Korea will likely react with more weapons tests. That's what they did when they did their recent big aerial war games. They did more weapons tests, and then they extended the drills, and then there was more weapons tests. This is just what's happening all the time now. And despite this, the Biden administration has not changed its approach to North Korea, and they're still calling for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is a non-starter for talks with Pyongyang, especially amid the current tensions. A more realistic approach, if the U.S. wanted to change things here, would be to offer sanctions relief. But before that, just pausing war games would be a good first step. Offer some sanctions relief just for talks, and or for a freeze in their nuclear weapons program. Don't say that they have to dismantle it. Just you got to get talking if you want anything to happen, and nobody's talking. All right. So the next one, this is actually from Politico, the European Politico. And so a big part of Macron's visit was about this Inflation Reduction Act that I've talked about a little bit. The Europeans aren't happy because it includes these subsidies for, what they call green companies or green energy. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I don't know too much about it, but I know that France and Germany are not happy. So this Politico article titled "Trade War Averted, Macron Gets Biden to Tweak His Industrial Subsidies." Basically, I think they might be a little optimistic in this write-up of it, in this Politico story, because Biden and Macron met, and then afterwards Biden saying, "Oh yeah, we're willing to tweak these subsidies so Europe benefits from it too, so it doesn't drive all the industry away from Europe into the United States." And it's this bill, Inflation Reduction Act, it includes $369 billion in subsidies and tax cuts for what they call green industry. That's just going to make more inflation, but it could drain investment out of the EU and into the US. Big car making nations like France and Germany have complained that the US law was potentially illegal for discriminating against foreign companies in the electric vehicle sector and encouraging consumers to buy American. So let's see exactly what he said. So Biden said that there's tweaks they can make to fundamentally make it easier for the European countries to participate and or be on their own. So I guess he's saying that they might, I don't know, enjoy some of these subsidies too or something. Who knows exactly what he means. But the reason why I say maybe they're a little too optimistic here is that, this is legislation that passed through Congress and was signed into law. I don't know how easy it is to really change it, especially when it's such a big piece of legislation like that. And then the last one here, this is from the Times of Israel, which is an outlet we usually wouldn't normally run, but it's about, the Israeli elections and Netanyahu forming his coalition government. And he's going to give Smotrich he's considered a far-right Israeli who is going to be in his coalition. He's going to give him broad powers over settlements and Palestinian construction. So Prime Minister designate Benjamin Netanyahu granted far-right leader Bezalel Smotrich extensive powers over Israeli settlements and Palestinian construction in the West Bank as part of a coalition deal signed on Wednesday between Smotrich, his religious Zionism party, and Netanyahu's Likud. So under the agreement, authority over the settlement and open lands division in the powerful civil administration and coordinator for government activities in the territories. So that's a body that is very involved in the construction and of Israeli settlements and stuff, and the demolition of uh, Palestinian homes and also Palestinian construction is going to be handed to a religious Zionism minister based in the defense ministry. So normally it would be the defense minister that this all falls under. And I think they were pushing to get a religious Zionism guy made the defense minister. But according to this deal, they're making kind of a new minister. Maybe it's not a new minister, but it's a minister within the defense ministry that's going to be handed more powers than usual. And Channel 12, which is Israeli television, they reported that the minister will likely be Smotrich himself. And basically, it's not exactly clear if this is going to give them total authority to approve settlements, because but they are definitely going to have a lot of control over it. And this is handing, this power of expanding settlements and demolishing Palestinian construction to the settlers. Smotrich is a settler. He lives in a settlement in the West Bank, and he's very extreme. And he wants to push out the Palestinians. So some people have said this could be de facto annexation. Again, it depends exactly how much power he's really going to have here, but it seems like it's going to be a lot. And one thing that this could affect is the Abraham Accords that Netanyahu signed with the UAE and Bahrain back in 2020. Because under those agreements, he agreed not to try to annex the West Bank. And some people are saying that this is kind of a slow rolling of annexation, which essentially settlement expansion is just a slow de facto annexation anyway. But handing this power to these settlers is going to speed it up a lot. And Netanyahu, when he was in power, he really did speed it up. Him and Trump, there was no pressure from the U.S. not to slow down. And they really approved a lot, like a record number in a certain amount of years of settler homes. And they really expanded, and they demolished a lot of Palestinian homes and structures. Okay, so that's it for the news. That's it for the week from me. We have good viewpoints that you could go check out, including one from Kelly Vlahos over at Responsible Statecraft about, NATO's promise that Ukraine could eventually become a member. And I like the way she put it. She says NATO again dangles membership in front of Ukraine, because that's really what they're doing. They're just dangling it. It's not like they're actually going to get it anytime soon. Also have one about Kamala Harris. This is over at the Libertarian Institute from Nikki Deal, and it's about her trip to the Philippines, how it stirred this conflict with China. Eric Horowitz, NYT, has found a new neo-Nazi group to lionize in Ukraine. So this is from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. It's basically, it looks like the New York Times did this piece on another neo-Nazi group inside Ukraine. What's their name? The Bratsvo Battalion. I never heard of them, but you should go check that out. And American forces needlessly caught in Turkish crossfire. This is over at the American Conservative from Natalie Armbruster, just about the situation. U.S. troops are in northern Syria with this looming Turkish invasion and all these Turkish airstrikes that have been launched. It's just a big tripwire for a larger conflict, and it puts them in harm's way. And then our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone. NATO exists to solve the problems created by NATO's existence. And she actually opens it with a quote from my article about, NATO's promise to Ukraine. But that's it. Again, that's it for the week. I'll be back on Monday. Like and subscribe on YouTube and Odyssey and Rumble, and share the show on social media and do all that good stuff. But thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you in a couple days.